Hi, good afternoon. I'm Phil Skroska. I'm one of the archivists here at the Bernard Becker Medical Library. And first, I want to remind everyone that following this lecture, there is a reception with refreshments over in the Becker Library on the 7th floor, where you can also see our new exhibit titled Compounding Potential, the History of the Neurosciences at WashU. And now I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Historia Medica lecture, hosted by the Center for History of Medicine and the Bernard Becker Medical Library. This is the 25th year of these Historia Medica lectures. I'm very happy to welcome our speaker tonight, who is Dr. Carolyn Baum, Fellow of the American Occupational Therapy Association and Professor Emerita of Occupational Therapy, Neurology and Social Work at WashU. She had been the Elias Michael Director of the Program of Occupational Therapy for 31 years. In a career spanning more than 50 years, Dr. Baum helped develop the science-driven practice of occupational therapy and pioneered the translation of neuroscience research into wellness and quality of life for patients and their families. Dr. Baum came to WashU in 1976 to run the occupational therapy clinics at Irving Walter Johnson, which only then had a staff of 5 occupational therapists. She quickly grew the service, expanding into pediatrics, nephrology, rheumatology, and rehabilitation, and in neurology, building relationships with the medical staff along the way, especially in neurology. And for a little bit of historical perspective, neurology has, for much of its history, been a very challenging specialty, above all because therapies for neurological patients have been very few. Neurologists could diagnose degenerative diseases like dementia, make assessments of stroke, but couldn't do much for patients. As an example of some of the desperation these patients felt, when Joseph Erlanger, the great early neurophysicist here at WashU, won the Nobel Prize in the 1940s for his work on electrical action potential of nerve fibers, he received letters from around the country from patients suffering from neurological diseases, asking if somehow his discoveries could help them. And while Erlanger's research did not offer immediate therapies, there was a momentum building here at WashU that would lead to real improvements in the lives of neurological patients and their families. Throughout her time here, Dr. Baum has been engaged with how to support people with neurological defects, deficits, or cognitive loss, and to help them live the best lives possible. With the encouragement of WashU neurologists who witnessed her work, Dr. Baum became director of the program in occupational therapy in 1988. As director, she changed the program really from a training program into an academic discipline and was a driving force in promoting these changes within the profession itself. Beginning in the 1990s and working with colleagues across the university from psychology and social work and the neurosciences, she developed occupational therapy assessments that would demonstrate what people with cognitive loss actually can do, such as the activity card sort and the executive function performance test. Dr. Baum led the development of the Cognitive Rehabilitation Research Group at WashU, which brought together biological and rehabilitation scientists to translate research into rehabilitation strategies. She has served nationally as president of the American Occupational Therapy Association, president of the National Board of Certification of Occupational Therapy, and has been on national advisory boards such as the National Institutes of Health, and has testified before Congress to help shape national policy. Among her many honors are the Award of Merit from the American Occupational Therapy Association, election to the American Occupational Therapy Foundation's Academy of Research, and WashU's own Distinguished Faculty Award. Please welcome Dr. Baum.
Thank you so much for coming today, and I'm very happy to be able to share with you a journey of how the development of the science of occupational therapy has contributed to a greater understanding of the translation of neuroscience to everyday life. Neuroscience principles enabled occupational performance. They do enable occupational performance that support recovery and help people gain the skills to participate in their activities that are central and meaningful to everyday life. My goal today is to share with you studies, assessments, and interventions to foster development and recovery of brain function to support people's daily lives. I'm highlighting on this slide the current definition of neuroscience. Neuroscience is the interdisciplinary study of structure, function, development, and pathology of the brain and how neural processes give rise to perception, cognition, and disease. I want to put performance and participation in that definition, as we now have the body of knowledge to really know what to do to help people help themselves. Neuroscience and OT, occupational therapy, share a historical figure. Adolf Meyer was one of the founders of neurobiology. He's very prominent in psychiatry and neurology. And in 1921, he came to the new profession of occupational therapy to define the theory of occupation. His challenge, which is our concept of man, is that of an organism that maintains and balances itself in the world of reality and actuality by being in active life and active use. This hypothesis challenges occupational therapists and provides the hypothesis for the work that continues today. Today, I'm going to share with you 3 questions that have been posed to me that have organized my science and yielded an understanding of how the brain supports individuals to carry out their everyday being in active life and active use. I have to start with a story. It's not switching. I'll go on with my story while you fix it. Are you up there? Okay, there's the other one. Okay, that's the one I want, but how do I get to it? In 1978, I was filling in for a therapist that was on vacation on the neurology unit, and there was this man who kept staring at me with my patients, and I was really kind of uncomfortable with it. But he finally came over to me and said, "How do you get people to do things that I don't think they can do?" I said, "Well, I learned in school that you find out what motivates them and what they need to do, and then you break the task down into parts so they can be successful with each one." He said, "Is there a science to support that?" I said, "I just learned that's what I was supposed to do." And he said, "You go to the library and see if it's published." Well, the librarians helped me, and we could only find studies that indicated that people with dementia were a cost to society and a cost to their families by having being a burdensome situation. I went and reported to him, and he said, "You have work to do." And I said, "I'm a clinician. I don't have skills in research design or statistics." He said, "I'll find someone to help you." Well, Dr. Dorothy Edwards had just finished her PhD in psychology and aging at Washington University, and we became partners. And I started laying out how we would address this question. Together we did this. And we had a lot of questions we had to be able to answer. What do they do now? What do people with cognitive loss, what have they done in the past? How much help do they need? What behaviors do the caregivers observe? Do they have memory capacities? Can they solve problems? Do they initiate? Are they safe? Is the care provider burdened? And does the care provider need skills? Well, we started building school skills because Dr. Berg had invited us to become a part of the Memory and Aging Project. And they were asking some of the questions. They had the clinical dementia rating, and they had the short blessed, and they had the Barthel, and the memory problem behavior checklist, and the Zaret burden interview. It was saying what the problems were, not what the person could do. So as we got to work and started to collect data to build these tools, which at that time were the kitchen task assessment, the activity card sort, and the functional behavior profile, I needed to understand the statistics we were getting, and I didn't know how to do it. And the psychologist I was working with looked at means and standard deviations of behavior, and I kept seeing things that I needed to know why there was so much variance. So I was told I should get my own PhD, and I did. I was 45 years old, and I went up to social work, and I met Nancy Morrow-Howell, who's in the audience today, and God bless her. She agreed to be my mentor and guided me through this process. I also had the help of Dr. Ed Spitznagel. Many of you may know him, or at least have known him. And he made this work possible because we were going to need to use structured equation modeling to do the analysis we needed. And neither Dorothy Edwards or I had had linear algebra or calculus, both which were necessary to understand the statistical approach. Well, he taught us math, and he was on my dissertation committee, and he helped me answer these questions. So, Dr. Berg's question changed my life. This is the structured equation model that's looking at the relationship between a person's capacity, what they need to do, and how the caregivers perceive that experience. I found that people with Alzheimer's disease who were kept engaged in overlearned activities showed fewer disturbing behaviors and needed less help with their activities of daily living. And we also found that the disturbing behaviors were what contributed to the demand and emotional stress experienced by the caregivers. All of you that are parents understand how you feel when someone's really acting out. It's disturbing. Well, people with dementia have a lot of problems because their sensory information is coming in and not being able to be processed, and so they have to be upset and try to do things they can do. What this work did is it challenged health professionals to train the caregivers to gain skills to set up activities for their loved ones to do the activities that are routinized and use the overlearned skills, and also how to communicate to them with simple commands. What we found out was being active is really important. When we published one of our measures, the kitchen task assessment, which I must say I got made fun of a lot for because I was having somebody make packaged cooked pudding. Well, you have to stir it and turn on the stove and keep from burning yourself and measure and do all kinds of things with that task. And then the caregiver could eat the pudding with the person who they didn't think could do anything. So anyway, the neuropsychological tests that were in the Memory and Aging Project all correlated with the kitchen task assessment. And one of the psychologists pointed out, Carolyn, I think you have a performance-based test of executive function. This question led to the next step in my journey. How do we use knowledge generated from the cognitive neuroscience science to improve the everyday lives of people with brain injury? I had met Susan Fitzpatrick, the Associate Director of the James S. McDonald Foundation, through a mutual friend at NIH. The foundation had a critical role in funding the development of cognitive neuroscience in the 1980s. Some of you in the audience may know a lot of the scientists that here at WashU that were funded by that foundation that put neuroscience forward. And so the reason they did that, they were prompted by Mr. McDonald's interest in the brain because he'd had a stroke. So when the question came out from the foundation requesting a pilot study, this was the question. This is 1996. And I asked all the behavioral scientists from the Memory and Aging Project, the psychology, neurology, and philosophy program scientists, which were under Andy Clark, who was a friend of mine, my neighbor actually, and the neuroradiologists that were building imaging to meet to see if we wanted to respond. Over 30 scientists came to the meeting, and we did decide to do it. We applied, and in 1996, we started the Cognitive Rehabilitation Research Group. We had $6 million over 10 years to be able to work as neuroscientists, rehab scientists, and psychologists to begin this process of having an interdisciplinary effort on the contributions to neuroscience. And I want to give you a few highlights. Alex Dromerick was with us, and he built the NIH, or the BJ Hospital Clinical Core, and then he went on to conduct with our pilot data, the NINDS eye care clinical trial that still to this day is basic to understanding how critical early motor recovery and rehab is in people with stroke. Tom Thatch, some of you will remember Tom Thatch. He got excited because he started seeing the cerebellum's role in cognition. And he had been very motor-oriented physician before that time. Maurizio Corbetta's work on visual inattention provided clinical implications. Dorothy Edwards, Lisa Connor, and my work. Lisa had joined us at the end of that, or before it ended, and we were studying mild stroke, and we identified the cognitive mechanisms that have to be identified and managed in early rehabilitation. And then Catherine Lang's work on neural mechanisms of motor control was also involved. I want to show you what we actually did. All of the patients hospitalized and served by the neurology service at Barnes Jewish Hospital are consented, or were consented, and still most of them are for another study, to be approached for studies for their data to be entered into a clinical core. And those who consented were included in a patient registry, a lesion registry, a behavioral performance, and an outcome data registry was in a SAS web-based data set. And this data enabled to help us initiate pilot clinical trials, develop measures, study structure and function, and it helped the people in the Memory and Aging Project start to understand the natural history of stroke with Alzheimer's. We, in that period of when we had clean data from 1999 to 2007, collected data on 7,217 patients with our clinical core data. And the data formed this registry, and today the registry continues in a form, but there are over 30,000 patients in it. So any patient who'd had a stroke and was admitted was put into this registry. Now, what did we learn? It took us a while to build our core assessment constructs, but what we were able to do was look at the lesions, stroke severity, socioeconomic status, premorbid disability, ADLs, and the cognitive constructs, we were really interested in the whole idea of, we knew a lot was going on in sensory and motor, but not very much was being studied in terms of the cognitive processes that drive performance. And so we had a very comprehensive cognitive battery, and we had a good follow-up with activities of daily living, participation, psychosocial capacities, executive performance, and environmental support. And so we had over 100 papers during that period of time among all of us. And we trained hundreds of students and offered training to our new PhD program in OT, in rehabilitation and participation science. I want to just give you a little bit of the data because it's really interesting. This is our lesion registry, and out of over 5,000 patients that the radiologists read the CAT and the MRI scans on these patients, only 344 people had single lesions. So what we were learning is it wasn't a matter of just one area of the brain being affected, but in fact there were multiple lesions in people that made returning to everyday life pretty complicated and required a lot of learning. This is the other thing we learned. Stroke was thought to be a condition of older age. Well, 6% or 5% of the people were under the age of 40. And you add that with, this is the severity, well, not the age, the severity. The 49% had a mild stroke. They had no aphasia, they had no major motor problems, and they rarely get services because they can do their ADLs, and that's the screening to get people to rehabilitation. So here are people with a lot of problems in their daily life, but they are not getting rehabilitation because they haven't been recognized as having problems. 32% had moderate strokes, and those are the ones that easily go to rehabilitation. 17.9% had a severe stroke, and 6% didn't live. But here's the interesting thing. 5% of the people having stroke were under 40. 22% were between 40 and 55, and 18% were between 56 and 64. Which means that those people who had the mild strokes were not really getting services because rehab teaches people how to take care of themselves with their ADL and their daily functions, but doesn't teach them how to go back to work or how to get on with the important issues in their lives. So only 55% were at the age that traditionally was thought of those that our stroke system is designed to be able to address. So let's look at this. This is a population of 219 people that had the mild stroke. And for the neurologists in the room, you can see the NIH stroke scales very, very low. But 30% of them had problems with ambulation. They were not steady on their feet, but they could walk. 35% had communication, emotional well-being problems, memory and attention problems, and weren't able to handle their household chores. And 40% were having social interaction problems. So their daily lives had changed dramatically. 62% had decrease in work activity. 36% had a decrease in social activity, and only 26% went back to their prior level of activity, yet 35% of them received no rehab at all. So let's look at the impact that stroke has had on activity participation. Those with frontal lesions have given up the most activities, followed by non-frontal cortical lesions and deep hemisphere groups. However, it's important that all participants, other than the control group, have lower activity levels, and the major efforts where they are lower are in high fitness goals that require activities for health and fitness, and things like walking and exercise and engagement in heavy-duty household chores. So they're really living pretty sedentary lives. Okay, so this work did not end with the end of the funding, but I do want to tell you what really happened. We provided pilot work for 3 NIH R01s. Our measures are used in the Brain Behavior and Performance Service of the ICTS, which is the Translational Research Science program here for clinical. We had a doctoral student that worked with people with cancer and identified mild cognitive problems in cancer. We had another one that identified the cognitive issues in people who've had hip fractures. The Memory and Aging Project saw the time course of dementia in persons with stroke and amyloid deposits. We provided data management for the Barnes-Jewish Hospital Stroke Center of Excellence. They became a center of excellence. We provided the patient access and data management for the NIH SPOTRIUS Trials Center. We did a lot of work on measures of functional cognition and activity participation in interventions, but mostly we identified the relationship between neuroscience and everyday life and found that interdisciplinary work was possible and needed. So, the curve was over, but much remained. So I'm going to tell you the third thing that happened. In 2008, another really important question to answer was presented. Remember, I told you that the psychologist said I might have a performance-based test of executive function? I really didn't know what it was. It wasn't how psychologists were defining executive function, which was much more problem-solving and language and processing speed and working memory, not doing. And so during the curve, we did a lot of work and we revised the kitchen task assessment into something called the executive function performance test because I thought it was a performance of executive function. And instead of just having the pudding, we switched it to oatmeal. And because we had a lot of, people didn't mind if they had to make oatmeal. Somebody didn't like pudding. But anyway, then we put in paying a bill and taking medications and making a phone call. Those 4 tasks are absolutely critical for someone to be home at home, especially if they're alone during the day. They have to heat something up, they have to manage their lunch, they have to make an emergency phone call, and they really we need to see what's going on with their cognition. So what happened was, very interestingly, this study was done to validate all the traditional cognitive measures with the NIH toolbox, and I was invited to use the performance-based test. So there were 600 people at 6 sites. 200 had stroke, 200 had spinal cord injuries, and 200 had head injuries, but they were living in the community. They were not institutionalized, and many of them were living alone. And we had all of this cognitive data on these people. And what happened was very important because we had a large enough sample size to do the factor analytic work that needed to be done to see if this functional part was really executive function. And what we found out was that when we did an explanatory factor analysis, the rotated factor matrix identified 3 factors, 5 items from the toolbox which matched what fluid is, were different than 2 items on crystallized, which is what crystallized is, and there were 5 from the EFPT, and what it did was look at can they initiate, organize, sequence, use good judgment and safety, and complete a task. And it was different than traditional neuropsychological tests that are very often what's captured in clinical studies. So, I had a brilliant student who wanted to learn how to do neural network analysis, and we had a large enough sample to do this. And lo and behold, we also had people telling us what they were doing in their daily life, and that was finances and chores and meal preparation and going out and social activities and leisure activities, so that we could look at these cognitive constructs to see how they actually are needed in the recovery or the doing of everyday life. And they all 3 showed their individual relationships. Every single cognitive construct that's on this, from fluid and crystallized and functional, are needed for everyday tasks. They have to be put together in people's minds. So let's look why, when we actually perform a task, we're integrating a lot of sensory and motor processes, but specific cognitive processes are required to support the effort, which means they have to maintain attention, hold information, mentally manipulate it, suppress irrelevant information, not go beyond thinking and planning. They have to sequence the task. They have to monitor it and correct errors and make safe judgments. So that these living in the community, living a life, involves a lot of complex activities. But what we do in rehab is that we work on mostly basic ADL skills, and they're overlearned and don't require the same level of new information and learning to support as these more complex tasks. So we're doing a really interesting project with engineering I'll talk about within just a minute, but the brain processes needed for sensory input, cognitive processing, and motor behavior when we were working with engineering, we're working on one task, the oatmeal task, and they had to, in order to use machine learning, they had to have it broken into individual steps. And making oatmeal takes 30 steps, and some of them are sensory, and some of them are motor, and some of them are cognitive. So it just gave us a much greater understanding of what really is going on in the brain to do these things that people really do have trouble with. So traditionally in rehab, the question is, how much difficulty does the person have doing the task? And so you always record the level of help they need. You're not answering questions about difficulty. What do they do? What do they want to do? How's the impairment? Is it a chronic condition that affects their engagement in daily activities? Is it something they can learn? The impact they're having on interventions and what the family observes. So I'm going to quickly share with you 3 of the instruments that we developed initially through the CURB that are now used nationally and internationally in this neurological population. And the first one is, well, I wanted to say one more thing. All of these mechanisms that we've studied for years as a part of neuroscience have to come together to support these more complex activities. And we have to have environmental support. And we, as OTs, really look at the environment and how it supports the performance in these tasks. And all of us use our environments. We wouldn't be here today if we didn't have these systems working that let us get ready to come, and we can do our jobs and do what we want to do. But people with neurological problems have had an insult that disrupts this process desperately, that requires a lot of continued relearning to be able to do it again. So I want to talk just a minute about why. I want to go back to Meyer for a minute and remind us all that he said we must be in the world of reality and actuality by being in active life and active use. Well, let's look at the neuroscience principles that are supported by activity. Everyday activities offer the opportunity for neurons and neural networks to change their connections to foster development and recovery. Activities offer co-activation, repetition with progressive challenge, and goal-directed practice. They offer personally chosen things that are motivating, that enable modulated gating. The activity sculpts specific circuits to support learning, sequence formation, working memory, and recovery, and experience and environment shape the brain structure. So we need to use activity. What does the person already know how to do, and how can they go back to it so that they can have the repetitions and the processes that make it possible for them to repair pathways and get new ways of doing things? How can you use that activity to therapists out there? How do you use it in your treatment to give the repetition and the meaning to the person so that they can relearn after a stroke? And the most important thing about activity is you have to set the goal as the motivator, because people can't do what they used to do. They've got to learn to do what they used to do, which is a really difficult developmental stage for the nervous system. And then we can use the activity as treatment. So how do we measure it? Here's where I wanted to go. We developed the activity card sort. I did it in my dissertation to find out what people with Alzheimer's could do, and we're now in the third generation, and we got an SBIR to build an electronic version that's just about to come out, which is really good because you touch buttons, and I've never done this, I'm doing it now, I'm doing it less, I've given it up, I'd like to do it. So it gives you a profile in a very short period of time, about 10 to 15 minutes, of who this person is and what their activity pattern looks like. It also has 3 pictures on every page of different ages and different cultures, so people can see themselves in the activity instead of just answering a questionnaire. I can get to that one. It also tells you, gives you a report of what you're doing now, what you're doing less, what you've given up, and what you'd really like to do. So it helps the clinicians bring the goal to the intervention that's going to put the repetitions in place for people to be able to function. And then it also, this is a study I did with Nancy Morrill Hall. We looked at what are the barriers to doing activity. And we found out that, yes, they can't do it as fast, they can't do it as well, but one of the things is, and the major thing is, they don't have anybody to do it with. So what do? We bring the family into the process so that the person can do what they want to do and be supported in it as a part of their brain's recovery after injury. So that's the activity code sort, measure 1. The next is the functional behavior profile. What can you, as a physician, as a scientist who's working with a person that has cognitive problems when you're trying to get them to do your task, or what can the family observe in a person who has cognitive loss? Well, they have difficulty problem solving, they have difficulty with past performance, and they have problems with social interactions. So I'm just showing quickly some of the data that we can get from this kind of measure by just having a person, family, or someone say what they can do. And you can see that with decline in cognition, and questionable is, that means nobody knows what's really going on yet. They're still not perfect in their behaviors, but they decline in the mild and moderate and severe stages. But one of the things I want you to see here is that people, even with severe dementia, really like to be a part of the social experience of the family. It's not just in a room and go see them. It's like bringing them into the experience of what's going on, because they still can process some of that information. Can't do very much, but can be enjoyed. And then we see difficulty with finishing tasks. Well, that makes sense. They don't have good attention. They don't have, their processing speed is slower, and they're not very timely doing tasks. And so you can observe those things as you see people perform. And then probably the most important thing we learned out of this is that we all talk to people with cognitive loss as though we expect them to do what we've asked them to do. If it's more than a one-step command and they have pretty severe cognitive problems, it's too complicated for them to process with their working memory to be able to put the pieces together to do what you're asking them to do. And so I'll just tell you a really quick story, because I skipped on some others. I was walking down the hall in the neurology unit, and I heard a nurse say to a man, "You've got to go to bed now. I have to go to conference before shift change." And he sat there. I went and made a splint and came back, and she was still trying to get him to go to bed so she could go to her conference so she could change shift. So I just stepped in and I said, "I don't know, I think it sounds like you're pretty frustrated with this. Could I try?" And she said, "Please." And so I went in and I took a hold of the man's hands and I said, "I'm going to help you. Let's scoot forward on the chair. Okay, let's stand up. Let's turn. Let's walk." He was in bed in a minute. Because some people with cognitive loss can only process something as simply presented to them. So just remember that if you have a family member that's dealing with Alzheimer's, or if you're in a situation where you're dealing with someone who has some cognitive problems, make things simpler. Okay, I'm going to give you 2 brand new ways to look at daily life that's technology-based, and this has been fun because ecological momentary assessment with accelerometer is a technology that you can use in studies, but I think it has major clinical applications, and I'll show you why, where we can actually see what people are doing if they're in rehab. And everybody said, "Oh, they've had a stroke. They won't be able to put the stuff in their phones." Well, yes, they can. And they 93% of 40 people, almost everyone, was excited to give this report of their daily activities using accelerometry. And what it tells you is what they do. And we don't know what people are doing, but the 5 major activities in these 40 people, some of them still worked a bit, but they watched TV, they ate, they rested, and they worked on their computer. Those are not exactly activities that promote the level of health, because we also have science coming from behavioral scientists that's telling us the critical thing that you shouldn't be sedentary in your activities and you shouldn't be socially isolated. So we've got to put all this together when we really start thinking about how we're going to help people. The other thing we're doing with engineering is a machine learning approach that It's unobtrusive because it's using cameras and sensors and measures performance. And using AI is data-driven. And actually, we're very proud because the young man that's doing the PhD work on this won one of the National Google Fellowships for his work, because what they identified was that traditionally AI had been telling people, cueing them with what to do, and now they're trying to use our work to look at, can the machine pick up things like initiation and organization and sequencing and making errors. So there's possibilities for some very interesting technology things. Okay, I'm just about done. I want to tell you that occupational therapy interventions use neuroscience principles. That's what we do. We help people live their lives, and we have to give them the experience that they're going to relearn to do them. And so all the things that we take for granted about our daily lives are not easy for someone who's had even the mildest neurological damage. I don't know if you saw it, but when I showed the NIH stroke scale, there are people that have 0. So they've still had a stroke, but they don't score on the tool that people would recognize that was a problem. So one, the tasks have to be adapted to the person's goals, their environment, and their capabilities at the time, so that they're putting themselves in a learning situation. And so when we're using activities, we're really dealing with sequencing and problem solving and all kinds of cognitive functions that have to come back together to take the sensory input, to put the cognition behind it, to get the motor output. And I went to the literature and looked at all of the validated OT interventions that are currently in use, and they have 4 core principles that are neuroscience principles that have to be in those interventions. People have to set their own goals, and that taps the motivation. Guided discovery is the way we interact with people in terms of helping them form the strategy to do the task instead. It's what you do with your kids. We guide them to the right decisions. We guide people to be able to do the things they need to do. And the practical support just supports repetition so that recovery and in children development occurs. We all know this in children, but we don't always think about it so much when someone's had a neurological problem, that they too have to relearn and reestablish those tracks. And the experience to overcome environment barriers and acquire self-efficacy that supports daily life, because people have to know that they can do it. They need the experience of being guided to do things so they can go on and live their lives. And we developed an intervention called Engage, which is at the community level. And honest to God, this woman just won an award at the University of Pittsburgh, who was totally a motor stroke with no control over her extremity. She's now walking and using her arm and teaching at the medical school, because she found out that the more she did, the more she learned and the more she could do. And so we just have to think that way. So what is this knowledge needed? This is where OT comes in, and I have to give you just a little understanding of, everybody doesn't quite get it, but occupation is performance. The activity of doing is the performance the person needs to achieve. And we're trained in behavioral things that come out of psychology, like self-efficacy and guided discovery and learning and things like that. But at the person level, we do have to understand the brain and the physiology system, and also that a person has a spirituality that has to be tapped in this whole process of recovery. And then, so we have to have neuroscience and anatomy and kinesiology. So understand the body, because capabilities and capacities come out of there, but the affordances come out of the environment. And so tools, adaptive equipment, family interventions, environments, and then access, how to advocate for themselves to get access to things, because what we're trying to do is to support that occupational performance, because it's with that performance that people participate, that they develop, that they are healthy, and they achieve their well-being. And so this is the curriculum of an occupational therapist, and it's called the PEOP model, which is part of, I was one of actually the person that developed the model in 1991, and it's now in its 4th edition, because it gives you a lens to look at how the brain is helping this person live their life. So anyway, I want to leave you with the thought that neuroscience is the interdisciplinary study of structure, function, development, pathology of the brain, and how neural processes give rise to perception, cognition, learning, performance, and participation, as well as understanding the diseases associated with it. So our science links brain, behavior, performance, and participation in daily life. And thank you, Washington University. Next week I will have my 83rd birthday, and this growth of this environment makes it possible to do anything, because you have good colleagues and good friends everywhere to help you. And this was an effort of many, many colleagues, many, many students, many, many PhD students, and we've all collectively contributed to this journey. And I was absolutely thrilled when asked to make this a part of the neuroscience journey here at WashU, because it really makes sense that we work together to be sure that people get to live lives, and it takes knowledge from all these levels. Thank you very much. You can ask me any questions you'd like, or
Thank you. If I could just ask you to speak into the microphone, just so.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful talk. I'm wondering whether you've had any experience retraining musicians after a stroke, because that music really influences almost every part of the brain, gives rise to rewards, gives rise to complex movements, and also to great satisfaction.
thank you for that question. And absolutely, that if you had done a really good occupational history of the person that you're going to need to understand to help, and saw music as a part of it, of course you would introduce that as a part of their learning and their motivation for being able to continue with the other things in their life that have to be managed. You don't play music in public if you're not dressed. I mean, there are so many things, but that's a huge motivator. Music is a huge motivator. Anything else?
Yeah, I did just have, you kind of talked about it a little bit at the end, but could you talk a little bit more about what makes WashU a special place to do this type of interdisciplinary work?
because we're a part of a medical school and a university that demands excellence. When I took over the OT department, there were literally 3 faculties and no science, and they were going to close the school because there was no effort on excellence and science. And so I had no choice. I didn't even have my PhD. I was just finishing my master's when I took over. And I knew that if we were going to survive, it would take more than a village. And I think the experience I had working at IWJ was seeing so many physicians and so many students with knowledge to help people that I just went on an exploration to find people that wanted to help us help them. And I feel that's a culture here because doesn't seem to be competition at levels where I have worked for. I worked 12 years before I came here. And I just think that the openness, the fact that we don't have a lot of administrative structure, we have people we can go to and find mentors. And so I just found so many people to help. There's no way that this could have happened if I had been an isolated person trying to do it.
Thank you. Carolyn, it's not a question. It's a comment. I think another special thing about you in particular is your ability to bring people together from all different disciplines. I think that, WashU people are willing, but you really were thinking big. And that was one of the reasons why you got the people together and you weren't afraid to involve them. It was there's a fearlessness and the big questions with some creativity on your side, like how am I going to get this to work? That really made this work. So I want to applaud you, and you paved the way for me. And I really appreciate that. And I, this is really a tribute to the work that you've done over these many years to get people to think bigger and to focus their attention on daily life and people's challenges that have neurological diseases.
I see another person in the audience that was one of those critical players in that, and that is Phil Miller. You said I should meet, her name just, in our friend in ophthalmology, Meg Gordon. He said, you should go meet May Gordon, because she was a woman who was fearless about interdisciplinary work. And so, I started working I have papers with her too, because I was sitting next to the head. I got to go to executive faculty and sit there, but I didn't get a vote. But I would always hear these experiences of people, and I was sitting next to the head of ophthalmology, and he didn't really know me, and he said, what do you think happens to people's function when they can't see very well? I said, well, I think it's a problem, but I've never studied it. Do you want to study it? So we started working. There's just so much we don't know. If we don't ask the questions, we don't understand that we can really put our talents together, and WashU lets that happen, plus the fact that I had 4 different deans, and I was head of the OT department, and we had to bring all of our own revenue in, and so I had to think very creatively on how we were going to get funding to do what we really needed to do. And so it literally took 40 years before we had the level of faculty that was really bringing in the big dollars. We get money from foundations, we get money from our associations, but we weren't we weren't enough of a scientist to get NIH money until about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it started happening, and now we have a lot of NIH-funded scientists in OT. And so you can make things happen, but you've got to be willing to realize you've got work to do. And I think that's what that word excellence means. You've got to do it so that it's going to really be prominent. And I think WashU lets you do that in any way if you want to.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Baum. I did want to remind everyone that we have a reception over in the library on the 7th floor. Everyone's welcome to join us over there and see the new exhibit on the history of the neurosciences. Thank you again.
Did you see my adaptation? I was afraid I couldn't turn the pages fast enough. So I went to Amazon and got a finger cutlet. Bye.